Joining us now, we've got the former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, Jeh Johnson. Also with us, former Democratic representative from California, now the Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Jane Harman. And in Washington, former DOD official and former Executive Director of the Graham Talent WMD Commission, Dr. Evelyn Farkas. She's a senior resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund and an MSNBC national security analyst. Secretary Johnson, we heard Secretary Nielsen repeating, "We need wall," in response to the discussions that she was having on Capitol Hill. It seems that experts have concluded that 21st century technology would be a lot more effective than steel slats. From your experience, what has worked best from stopping illegal immigration?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Mika. I have to say this about the government shutdown. We talk about a shutdown frequently like a political football, but as Casey just pointed out, it has consequences for hundreds of thousands of people who may not get a paycheck, including the TSA officers who screen for aviation security and will be protecting members of Congress as they go home for the holidays. So the experts include the Republican-controlled Senate. In fact, the Senate passed an appropriations bill for DHS that includes $1.6 billion for border security, which does not include a wall. It includes more fencing, more surveillance. Ask any border security expert, and they'll tell you that what we need on the southern border, more surveillance, more vehicles, more lighting, more roads, more boats, more planes, possibly more Border Patrol agents, but very few of them mention a wall. We actually have a wall already in places where it makes sense to have a wall. You can build a 10-foot wall on a 10,000-foot mountain, but somebody will then build an 11-foot ladder to get over it.
Right.
So we need to invest in the underlying causes of what's driving illegal migration from Central America. And there was a deal announced this week with the government of Mexico, which I think is a step in the right direction, to invest up to billions of dollars in addressing the poverty and violence in those countries. As long as those situations exist, we're going to be dealing with this problem forever.
Just to sort of, and I want to jump to Jane, but just really quickly, Secretary Johnson, aren't border agents, are they affected by a shutdown?
Well, they are essential government personnel like TSA officers, but during a shutdown, they don't get paid. And so we're asking these people, we're not asking, we're telling them you must go to work, but we're not going to tell you when you're going to get paid next. And after the shutdown is over, they retroactively get paid, but you don't know when that's going to happen. And people who are furloughed, there's no guarantee that they're paid. They're often paid later on.
All right, Jane Harman, talk about this wall that nobody wants, or at least some data shows it's pretty unpopular. We had reverse immigration flow during the Obama administration. What policies helped create that atmosphere?
Well, we have reverse immigration flow now from Mexico, and Jay was exemplary as Homeland Secretary to help make that happen. We have immigration flow from the Northern Triangle in Central America. And, oh, by the way, in the first year of the Trump administration, Mike Pence and John Kelly, then the Homeland Secretary, had a summit in Miami talking about aid to Central American governments so they could fight corruption, fight the drug trade, and stimulating business investment there, which would stop much of the push factor for these poor people. Will Hurd said the other day, Will Hurd is a Republican congressman on the border in Texas who used to work for the CIA, that the wall is the most expensive, least effective way to handle border security. Much better are drones, sensors, and the things that Jay was talking about. And let me just add one more thing. I'm for border security. I didn't meet a Democrat when I served in Congress for 9 terms, 17 years, who was against border security. Who would be against it? I'm for sensible border security, and not just on the southern border. More terrorists have tried to come into the U.S. from the northern border.
Jay, you served in the cabinet, obviously, as Secretary of Homeland Security. We just had one of those rare things in Washington, which was the resignation of a cabinet member. What was your take on that? And did you have in your own mind when you served, was there a standard or a criteria where you said, if this ever were to happen, I have to walk? What's your take on what basically seems to have driven Mattis out?
Well, first of all, I said in a speech at the Reagan Library 2 weeks ago, I sleep better at night with Jim Mattis on the wall, and I didn't sleep very well last night. So, resignation. The issue with resignation, and I appreciate why Jim did what he did, but the issue with resignation is you then leave the burden of the office and the decision making to someone else who may not be as sensitive as you are. And so I think the bar has to be pretty high before a cabinet officer decides that he has to resign, has no choice but to resign, because the mission goes on one way or another. And the president selected you to do the job, and a lot of people were counting on Jim to stay in office. I believe the reports that he felt he had to stay for the good of the country, but it obviously reached an intolerable point for him where he felt he could no longer effectively serve the president, he could no longer do the job, and I can only imagine, having worked there, that there are thousands of people in the Pentagon right now who are very, very depressed and disappointed.
Yeah. All right, so Evelyn Farkas, I want to bring you in because you've known Secretary Mattis for 20 years, worked with him, and I think that there's somewhat of a void that he's going to be leaving. Give us a sense of what you know of how that could play out and what exactly he was able to do in there to maintain some sort of order.
Yeah, I think, Mika, here's the thing. Secretary Mattis, first and foremost, he's a deeply patriotic man. So he felt that his mission was basically to defend America's national security interests and the men and women in the armed forces. I spoke to him when he took the job, right when he was taking the job. He called me to talk about Russia. And it was very clear then that he felt that his job was to be, he didn't use these words, but sort of the adult in the room, right? And so what's shocking is that in this letter now he has to outline what our foreign policy principles are, you know, why alliances are important to this president. You would never have to do that for another president. I think he did what he was supposed to do while he was in the government. And the reason the people on the Hill are very nervous right now is because they know some of the things that happened behind the scenes, some of the things that Secretary Mattis prevented. And, you know, I happen to know from folks who were in the room, for example, at the NATO summit last July, that Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, foreign leaders, Chancellor Merkel, and the head of NATO, they basically talked the president back from making a crazy statement that would have put us on the path to leaving NATO. So, you know, Secretary Mattis has actually done important work inside government, kind of making sure the guardrails were up. And I think he just got frightened with these latest decisions that he wasn't going to be able to do that anymore.
And James, how do you explain to the public Syria is not stable and what repercussions that has and why we should care about that?
Well, let me say first that I serve currently on the Defense Policy Board, 12 people, including Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright, who advise Secretary Mattis. And I served on the Defense Policy Board for the last 3 Secretaries of Defense since I left Congress. It's a high honor. And Secretary Mattis reaches outside for diverse views to make sure he's got it right. And there are some really tough issues that the Defense Department is facing. Many of them having to do with adjusting to the new forms of war involving cyber and AI. On Syria, what does a destabilized Syria mean for us? Well, hey, I thought we were for hopefully a transition for Bashar Assad, who used chemical weapons on his people. I thought we were for that. But surely now we leave a vacuum that Russia and Iran will occupy, perhaps working together. And let's remember where Syria is located. It's on the border of Israel. It's also on the border of Lebanon, which is digging tunnels into Israel. I don't understand why the Israelis aren't screaming about this. Saudi Arabia has been weakened, given the horror of MBS's involvement in this gruesome murder. And so they're not going to be able to protect Israel by themselves. And I just see this thing as cascading and creating chaos in the Middle East at a time when the U.S. was playing just the right role, training fighters and standing by our allies, the Kurds, in Syria and Iraq.
Jay, I want to come back to you and ask you about, to follow up on the question about resignation, and now Jim Mattis is gone. You got Mitch McConnell who comes in and says, you know what, President Trump, he seems to have reacted. He's obviously disturbed. He says, you gotta have another Jim Mattis who steps into this job. There's been some debate at this table this morning that suggests that some people's attitude is, well, obviously we would all prefer to have a Jim Mattis or a Jim Mattis-like figure, but Donald Trump clearly doesn't want that. This is that to have reached the point that we reached suggests that Donald Trump and Jim Mattis concluded that Donald Trump no longer has use for Jim Mattis or Jim Mattis-like arguments of a worldview. So right now, are we better off with maybe with the clarity that would come with Donald Trump appointing a Donald Trump defense secretary, or is this advice that Mitch McConnell's giving, which is I think Trump is not going to follow anyway, is that in some way more useful?
Very plainly, Jim Mattis told the president a lot of things he didn't want to hear, but I thought that it was obvious that Jim was pulling President Trump in the right direction on a lot of issues. And I know from personal experience, having worked with Jim in the Pentagon, he knows how to say no, you shouldn't do that. And the president, it's difficult to get that kind of advice. Very often you want to go in this direction, and the people that work for you want to take you in another direction. But you have to listen, you have to understand, and you have to appreciate what you don't know about the job, and listen to your wise advisors. And he's lost one yesterday. I'm very worried about the country, and I'm very worried about our national defense and who is going to be the next Secretary of Defense. Hopefully it's somebody who has the ability to gain the respect of the military and give the president straight, honest advice.
All right, former Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson, thank you very much. Evelyn Farkas, Jane Harman, thank you both as well. And up next, there's a reason he's one of the best historians out there. Michael Beschloss dug up this photo yesterday, 7 weeks before resigning the presidency. Richard Nixon flew to Syria to visit that country's ruling family, including 8-year-old Bashar al-Assad. Michael discusses the current president's relationship with Syria. Straight ahead, Morning Joe is coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.